Okay, back to Stokes and Turkish music, Turkish country music. So, secularism requires carving up social life into private and public spheres. Of course, if you have an ordinary job and you have a boss, you probably know the limits of your religious expression at work. Definitely, if you teach in a public school, you know what you can and can't say. There are very, very careful controls on religiosity in the workplace or education or government in the United States. If you're, preaching from a pulpit, advocating for this candidate over that one is sort of a not a wise thing to do. But it's never complete, right? There's always border porous boundaries in between. Goodness, that was a loud ding. Somebody's not texting me because that never ends. Okay, so spaces and places. So so this carving up social life in the public and private spheres is never complete anywhere, and Turkey's no different. Spaces and places. Western sites in Istanbul is where you find quote unquote modern music. Old sites in Istanbul is where you find the hybrid music for lower, middle, and working classes. Um, then there are official spaces, which include music conservatories, of course. The art music is going to be there, both Western and Eastern. People's houses seems to be a site for folk music. It's kind of unclear there. And then radio and TV stations and studios were all state-owned prior to the 1980s when they started selling those off to private investors. And then the fourth space here is the gazino, and this is the one that he really focuses on. Because he's a historian of music, he's an ethnomusicologist. So he was looking at gazino as a bar or cafe in the 18th century and the 1700s, and then in the 1800s and 19th century, they became music halls. They were still cheap enough in the 40s and the 50s to the 70s. The 40s was when this rural to urban migration began, as we're familiar with from McMurray. The same thing happens everywhere around the world. People move from the country to the city as mechanization comes to the countryside. People move to the city and work in factories. So they're coming to a place where they don't know anyone, they don't speak the right language, they don't know what they're doing, and so they go to the meeting hall. So a musician from their home country, from their home state, their home province, their home city, comes and plays at the casino, and everyone who's from that part of the country goes to see that musician. And when they get there, they're like, "Hey, you're from the next village over. Ah, I never knew you were here. Well, where do you live here in Istanbul? Oh, okay." And so then they meet and they hang out, right? So it's a meeting place for these popular classes, these workers who just moved here 5 years ago or last year, can meet up with other people from their home village. And then from the 50s to the 70s, the Gazino is the site of pop music. This is where these musicians who are singing in Turkish for the Turkish audiences are playing, just commercial stars. By the 1950s, these gazinos are too expensive for working class folk. Imagine this, as yourself, right? I mean, how many shows do you go see? And yeah, if you're in your 20s and you have a job, and you're not paying a mortgage and you don't have kids to take care of, you're probably spending quite a bit on concerts. But once you get older and you have a lot more commitments and a lot less um, easily expendable cash, you begin to realize that playing, going to watch someone play live music can be quite expensive. And if you do it more than every couple months, you begin to realize, you might have other places you want to spend that money. It's quite expensive. And so the same thing happens in the 1980s for the Turks. But it remains idealized as a nostalgic site of musical intimacy. And we'll talk about live music here in a little bit more in terms of Eastern music and live music. But any live music experience is really special because you have a musician playing for an audience, and if it's 10,000 people, that's different. But if it's a couple hundred people in a small venue, it can get really intimate. You can yell stuff at the singer, and he'll look up and smile, and it's neat. So so there's that kind of musical intimacy with live music that is gone. It's gone. I mean, you can go once a year, every 5 years or whatever, but it's not that sort of regular every weekend. Let's go see who's playing sort of experience. Method. So he has this method where he just looks at songs. This is ethnomusicology. So he's going to look at 4 different songs. Um, and the first 3 have a single singer. I mean, the song probably has a longer life than the one singer, but he's looking at this specific performance by this specific singer. The first 3, and then the 4th song is a single song that's done 3 different times by 3 different people. That's fun. What he's characterizing with these 3 phases or elements have to do, with the 3, the 1, 2, and 3 here, Malekshalendi Sular, Batsin Badunya, and Nea Larsen. These are 3 phases or elements of Turkish society in history. So secular and elite official nationalism. This is in the 50s to the 70s. 50s, we'll say 50s to 60s. And then traditional official, unofficial sectarianism, 70s to the 80s. And then modernist and neoliberal private Islamism, 90s plus. So this is the kind of world that Turks inhabit. Prior to the crisis of the 70s, which is a crisis everywhere on the planet, you find 1973 is sort of a crisis moment. And prior to that, you had official nationalism. The army was strong, the state was powerful, and there was plenty of money, and secularism was strong. After the crisis of the 70s, then you get some backlash to that. Traditional and popular unofficial sectarianism. Sectarianism meaning religion, right? So the religion comes in. People are realizing that the state actually has run out of money and can't do all it could before, and so they start to look to themselves, and so they're raising private capital, and then that private capital comes along in the 3rd period in the 90s and just overpowers the state. This is modernist and neoliberal private Islamism, and secularism is killed 90s plus. Okay, so Menekshalendi Sular is the waters went purple. Batsin Budunya, a curse on this world. Nea Larsen, why cry? And then Aziz Istanbul is beloved Istanbul, the tribute to this city that represents the new. It represents the Ottoman Empire long ago, but it also represents this new cosmopolitan, neoliberal, Islamist modernity. That's also got it's got other layers to it. So there's a lot of contested discourses on Istanbul, and that's why he closes with that song. Overall, 3 topics that Stokes wishes to work over in the Republic of Love. He wants to talk about love and intimacy. He wants to talk about the global city. And then he wants to talk about neoliberal transformation and love. So love and intimacy, he's looking at a 2006 article by a secularist journalist who wrote in an Islamist newspaper. So it's interesting sort of reaching out, trying to find middle ground between the old hardcore secularists and the new neoliberal Islamist Democrats. He says love is a national issue. The crisis of love is a political crisis, and love is something over which the religious right and the secular left can agree. This is this is the root, the origin of his book. And then he passes through the global city, talking about Istanbul's complicated position in the world as sort of this remnant of old-fashioned Ottoman backwardness that's opposed to Ataturk's gleaming new capital in the center of the country in Ankara. And then as Ankara comes eclipsed, old-fashioned state capitalism and secularism sinking into the mud and being replaced by this gleaming new old city that the tourists love, that was once the seat of the caliph, but is also a contested site of meaning. Istanbul. And then finally, neoliberal transformation in love. As Turkey turns from state capitalist to free market economy, what happens to love? What is it worth? Does love become sentimentalized? Right? Is it just sentiment? Is it not true love? It's just feelings of nostalgia and sadness. Is love thus degraded? Is love a distraction from the real world of money and power, guns, tanks, and bombs? What is love in there? Is there any love in the world? Do people do things for love or just for money? And then finally, is love an embarrassment? Are Turks poor lovers in all senses of that word? Okay, so I'm going to stop here and then I'll come back and talk about Oriental classical music because that's a little more complicated.